Right, so morning everyone, thanks for your patience. Always technological problems, especially with the people that like technology the least. But welcome, very nice to see you, very nice to see Belinda, looking very kind of sunshiny and healthy. I'm actually, as you know, kind of talking to you from Belgium, which is also wonderful, slightly strange, but yes, lovely to see you, Belinda. And I'm not going to say any more except welcome, and would you mind kind of introducing yourself? And yes.
Right. Thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this series of seminars again. I think everybody knows me. I'm Belinda de Plooy. I'm senior manager in engagement office at the university. My interests are largely in the area of film studies, literature, philosophy, and the larger humanities. And in a lot of my work that I've been doing since my master's degree, I've been, working with and thinking with ideas of pain and grief and healing. So my presentation for today, I called Stop All the Clocks, which many of you will recognize as the first line from W.H. Auden's famous poem. Okay, why am I not moving?
No, Belinda, you'll have to ask me to move because I'm sharing the screen. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Andrea. Okay, if you can move one down, please. So it's the first line from W.H. Auden's poem "Funeral Blues," in which he describes his reaction after his life partner passed away. I won't read the whole poem for you, but it's a description of that sense of shock and the inability to make things fit. To come to terms with how everything was fine yesterday, and today and tomorrow nothing will ever be fine again. So that's where the Stop All the Clocks come from, and I'll return to that as I talk. Thanks, Andrea. You can go one further. I always think about, if you have to describe difficult concepts, how would you describe it to a 6-year-old child? And basically, if you have to describe grief to a 6-year-old child, you would tell them that it's pain. There's a word that's very old-fashioned, and we don't tend to use it very, very often these days, but I think it's time for it to return, and that's the word sorrow. We talk about sadness, and we talk about melancholy, and we talk about depression, but none of those things describe grief. The closest word to describing grief is sorrow. And it's pain because it's literally your heart is breaking. Language is a very apt descriptor of the experience. And there are 3 types of pain that's usually associated with grief. You will go through emotional distress. So it's heart pain, all the emotions that just flood you. Psychic disturbance, brain pain. It's the cognitive dissonance of not being able to really come to terms and figure out what exactly is happening. And physical discomfort. Grief always manifests in some form or another in physical, discomfort. You might have digestive problems. You might have, headaches. You might feel just absolutely exhausted. So those 3 things are always in some form or another involved. The next one. Thanks, Andrea. And then in terms of the cognitive dissonance, I don't know of any other expression that so clearly captures that sense of your mind just can't wrap around the experience of what you have lost. And you might also, when you think of our situation with COVID now, and also for those of us who are thinking around echo grief, this is also very, very, very applicable there. So Emily Dickinson says, I felt a cleaving in my mind as if my brain had split. I tried to match it seam by seam, but could not make it fit. The thought behind I strove to join unto the thought before, but sequence ravelled out of sound like balls upon the floor. And I think that anybody who's been through the grief experience will acknowledge that very clearly describes that sense of your mind just can't wrap around what it is, that's happening to you. Thanks, Andrea. Next one. So we tend to think about grief as, a response to death, but many other things can also trigger grief experiences, and these are just, a couple of them. You can maybe think of your own life, and if any of these are experiences that you have experienced yourself, maybe somebody you care for or love, or somebody you know is going through something like this at the moment. And then, of course, we also think of, as I mentioned, the two free-flowing forms of grief that we have so much of in the world today, and that's the grief around COVID and the grief around the ecology. So even though the experience of grief is a response to death in its purest form, it is also the experience of something that feels like death. So in terms of job loss, there is something that dies. In terms of retirement, there is something that dies. And that is why it's the same kind of grief experience. Next slide. Thanks, Andrea. So Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, I think when we talk about grief these days, we immediately think of the stages of grief. And Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, who was just one of the most incredible people, she through kind of giving us the stages of grief, she gave us a cultural and a popular vocabulary by means of which we could speak about grief. Poets and artists, had depicted grief since time immemorial, and science is very good at, looking at brain chemistry and oxytocin and, all the neurological serotonin and, all those kind of things. But thanks to Kubler-Ross, we actually, had a vocabulary that every person in the street literally could speak about and relate to. So she posited that there are 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And then sometimes people put shock in as the first stage. Okay, next slide. Thank you, Andrea. But there are a couple of misconceptions that we just need to be aware of when talking about the stages of grief. And the first is that Elisabeth Kubler-Ross originally did not speak of stages of grief. It was stages of death. In her book on death and dying, she spoke about the 5 stages of death, and she after many years of research with terminally ill and dying people, she wrote this book in which she encapsulated actually 5 themes that emerged in her interviews with dying people about how they experience the knowledge of their own death. And then also, amazingly, when she was at the end of her life, she was terminally ill and dying and experiencing quite, going through quite a lot of suffering. And she managed to take her own life experience and apply that to the theory that she herself created. And she wrote with David Kessler 2 books on grief and grieving and life lessons, in which they speak of the 5 stages of loss, kind of expanding the idea of the 5 stages of death to become 5 stages of loss. And then that has culturally become accepted as what we now know as the stages of grief. And it has become, it's been applied to any kind of loss or the loss of another person, loss of a loved one, rather than just necessarily, thinking about the process that the individual goes through when they are confronted with their own mortality. And Kubler-Ross herself said that she was very sorry that she used the word stages because it gives the idea that it's linear and predictable. And then David Kessler, after her death, but with her full knowledge, posited meaning as the 6th, or if you'd count shock, the 7th stage of grief. So if you Google and read about the stages of grief, in some cases you'll see there's 5 stages, in some cases there's 7 stages, but it's essentially shock and meaning that are added as the first and the last stages. Thanks, Andrea. Next one. Okay, so very important that we just need to keep in mind that grief does not have stages. It's not linear and it does not end, which are some of the kind of the fallacies that we often think of when we think about grief. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Andrea. You're doing all the work for me now. Thanks. Okay, so a much more useful metaphor to use, and when you listen to people who talk a bit about their grief experiences, they will very often talk about the ocean. So the ocean is a much more useful metaphor, when we think of grief. Um, and people would describe things like it feels like you're hit by a tsunami. You're unprepared for it. It's overwhelming. You've got no defenses. You go under and you come up and you go under again. You gasp for breath. You tread water. There's no ground under your feet, no sight of land, no sense of direction. It feels like wave upon wave hits you. Each wave is different. There's the sense of flooding, which is a term which is often used in psychology as well. Your body and your spirit is pummeled and thrashed. You're absolutely exhausted. And then the two that I haven't read is really the most important. It's your life sense, your life and your sense of self and your place in the world is challenged, destroyed, and devastated. And you have to rebuild your sense of self and your place in the world all over again, often while the next wave hits you. Then also your life experience at the moment is that of a wreck or of a wreckage through which you must sift for what can be salvaged. You don't know if or when you'll be okay again until you are. And then the waves will get smaller, become ripples with time, and then something will happen that, unexpectedly, is a monster wave again. So that description of grief is much more, realistic. And as I said, the two bullet points in red that I have there is particularly important. That is what distinguishes something like sadness, or melancholy or depression, from grief. If it's grief that somebody is experiencing, there is that loss of a sense of self and loss of a place in the world, that you have to reorientate yourself entirely in terms of, who you are and what your life is. Next slide. Thanks, Andrea. So when we think about the theory of grief, when we stand back and we analyze it, that is what the theory of grief looks like. Pie charts and line diagrams. But grief feels like the following slide. Thanks, Green. Thanks, Andrea. That is what grief feels like. And the next slide. And the next slide. And the next slide. And that one specifically speaks to me because of the way the river bursts the banks. It cannot be contained, but also because of the frame around that picture. And that is part of my next slide. Andrea, if you can move one on. Okay, so we need to reframe our thinking about grief. And the kind of the knee-jerk reaction is to think of grief as a reaction to death and loss. But grief is a response to love. And if we start thinking about grief in that way, it's going to change our perspective tremendously, because loss and death in itself does not elicit grief. It is the love that is associated with what is now dead and what has been lost that is where the grief is lodged. Okay, thank you. Next screen, Andrea, thank you. Okay, so just a couple of ideas, very general, things that I want to mention about grief is that not all loss gives rise to grief. Not everything that is a loss will necessarily end in grief. Remember, I said those two red bullet points. If your sense of who you are and where you are in the world is destroyed, then it is grief. Also, not everyone experiences grief as a response to loss. So not all losses are not created equal. And then very importantly, grief depends on the relationship between the person and what was lost. It's not just the person or the thing that is lost, it is something inside of you that dies as well. Who you were because of your relationship with that thing or that person, whether it's your husband or your wife, whether it's your child, whether it's your home, whether it's your home country, your relationship with that means that something inside of you is lost and dies. And then anybody who's been through the grief experience will say to you that idea of lost is really ridiculous, because it's not like you're going to find it again. So anybody who's lost a person close to them will say to you, but he's not lost, he's gone. You know, it's not like his keys that I'm going to, you know, that I misplaced and I'm going to find again. So, you know, language plays tricks on us as well. So grief is the result of our entanglement with others and with the world. Then grief is not an illness from which we must heal, so we mustn't try and treat it that way. Guilt may very often be associated with grief, you know, and these are usually irrational senses of grief. So we're talking about survivor's guilt and guilt about feeling relief that suffering has ended. And I was wondering if one can talk about corona guilt and echo guilt as well. Then there's no time frame for grief and no hierarchy for grief. No one grief is more important than the other, or, you know, more extreme than the other. If you are in grief, that is your whole world. So, you know, kind of playing them up against like one another, you know, is just a senseless thing. And then there's no time, as I say, there's no time frame for grief. It goes back to that idea of stop all the clocks. When you're in that grief experience, it's like the entire world stops for you. And, you know, it might take 6 months, it might take 6 years, it might never end. So there's no time frame for grief. Then we must be very, very aware and be very careful of pathologizing grief. Grief is natural and normal. It's excruciating. It may feel unbearable, but it's not abnormal. Next slide. Thanks, Andrea. Okay, then grief is a common human experience, but it would manifest differently in different cultures. Grief is a sacred rite of passage. It's holy. It's a hero's journey. Grief is an event. Grief is not an event. It's a practice. You don't get over grief. You learn to live with it and grow around it. It changes you and becomes part of who you are. Very important, closure is a myth. We have to remove the ideal of closure and the idea that we're going to achieve closure. That puts a whole new level of stress on top of somebody who's already just trying to, you know, get through every day. Grief is an emotion. Mourning is behavior. And then ritualization and memorialization is essential in grief. It helps to create meaning, you know, throughout the grief process. And then we have to be very careful of the dangers of toxic positivity. Next slide, Andrea, thanks. Toxic positivity is a term that I've only been introduced to very recently, and I wish I'd known it many, many years ago. Toxic positivity is defined as the overgeneralization of a happy, optimistic state that results in the denial, minimization, and invalidation of the authentic human emotional experience. So you can imagine that if you are in the process of grief, that is really not helpful. Okay, next slide, Andrea, thanks. Okay, so a couple of terminologies that we encounter, you know, when we talk about grief. They often talk about complicated, complex, or compound, or there's a O left out, compound grief. That's usually when there's a sudden, unexpected, or an untimely death, a violent or a traumatic loss, or several losses at the same time or over a short time. So it's cumulative loss. The next loss comes before you could deal with the one before. Then there's ambiguous or unresolved grief, which is often the grief that is most pathologized. And that is when there's no clarity or resolution after a loss. So there's no body to be buried. Very often in military operations, when somebody's missing in action, dementia, refugees, kidnapping, those are usually the spaces within which we talk about ambiguous grief. And Pauline Boss, who is really the person who's most theorized ambiguous grief, she actually speaks of what we're going through at the moment with COVID as ambiguous grief as well. Ambiguous grief, she says, it's not that the person is pathological, but the circumstances are pathological. It's also sometimes called chronic grief. And then a lot of what we speak about today when we talk about intergenerational transmission of trauma and of the new field of epigenetics, and when we talk about the silences and the gaps in the stories that, you know, that we tell of our experience, that's very often where ambiguous grief is lodged. And then disenfranchised grief, that's the grief that is unacknowledged and unvalued. And I think one of the most poignant examples of a conflation of these three types of grief is found in Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. Now, I did my master's degree on this, so I do know, I acknowledge that I'm biased, in that, but it is such an eloquent description of how complicated grief, ambiguous grief, and just disenfranchised grief function, within a person, but also within a social grouping. So if you haven't read that, please make a point to read that novel. Next slide, Andrea. Thank you. Okay, some other terms is vicarious grief, which is something that we need to think about a lot these days as well. That's the experience of grief on behalf of or in response to experiences that are not your own. And we need to think about how that stands in relationship to empathy and to compassion fatigue, especially we're talking a lot about the first responders during the corona crisis. We also need to think about vicarious grief in the relationship to media and to desensitization. We carry these little devices in our pockets all day long, where immediately you can see, images, often very visceral images of pain and grief experienced by, people from all across the globe. So the way that the media makes vicarious grief accessible to us, we need to think about. Then there's anticipatory grief, and this is something that we're all dealing with at the moment during the COVID, and also the echo crisis that we're experiencing. That's when you have a sense of loss of safety or a sense of impending loss. So you're constantly trying to prepare yourself for future loss. It's also called pre-trauma. And a lot of people who deal with loved ones who have dementia or terminal illness live in that space of anticipatory grief. Secondary grief is losses that come after the original loss, sometimes very long after. Displaced grief is unconscious defense mechanisms to not deal with the grief. Delayed grief is when grief is not fully experienced at the time of the loss, but later. This is very often, the case in when people are caregivers. So if you lose your life partner and there are children, involved, you're going to first of all take care of the children. And put your own grief to one side. So delayed grief might then only strike you, a long time later. Collective grief, obviously, is when a social grouping or a community experiences the same loss, so we're all in the same boat. That's also very applicable to both the corona and the echo grief scenarios. And then there's public grief, when a large group of people, share grief, or when a public figure dies. And I think the most obvious example of that is, Andrea, the next slide, please. Thank you. Is, of course, the outpouring of grief that there was when Princess Diana died. That's probably the most eloquent example of recent public grief. Thanks, Andrea. Next slide. Okay, so there's a lot of free-flowing communal grief at the moment in the world. I want to go as far as to say that possibly anything with a hashtag in front of it, or that puts the word movement behind its name, is in some way articulating, or related to grief. But to just keep it contained here, I just want to talk about COVID grief and echo grief. But you can apply this to many other things, obviously, as well. Next slide. Thanks, Andrea. Okay, so today we are all grieving. If we think about both the echo and the COVID grief, because we experience a loss of freedom, we experience a sense of a predictable future. The lives and the roles we left behind, we are mourning. We feel fearful about our work, our health, our families, our shared future. We're afraid of our parents and grandparents, of our children, our jobs, our country, our way of life, and most deeply our own mortality. But Robert Weiss very astutely says that if we can understand grief, maybe we can get some insight into how to deal with, this collective experience. Next slide, Andrea, thanks. Okay, so David Kessler, who, as I mentioned before, worked very closely with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, he very recently said that it's very clear, there are very clear examples of the stages of grief, that we can identify today. So he says there's denial. He's specifically here talking about the COVID experience. Denial in statements like, this virus won't affect me, early on. There's anger in statements like, you're making me stay at home and I'm taking away my activities and my freedom. There's bargaining in statements like, okay, if I social distance for 2 weeks, everything will be okay. There's sadness in, I don't know when this will end. And then there's finally acceptance in statements like, okay, this is happening. I have to figure out how to proceed. And Kessler says that acceptance is where the power lies, because we find control in acceptance. Once we know I can wash my hands, I can wear a mask, I can stay a certain distance away from people. This is what I can do. This gives me some sense of control. Next slide, Andrea, thanks. And then he says that he goes back in his discussion, he goes back to anticipatory grief. Because that is what the most common experience I think that most of us are feeling, both in terms of the echo crisis and the COVID crisis. So he says anticipatory grief is unhealthy. Anticipatory grief is unhealthy anxiety. It's when our minds begin to show us images. You see your parents get sick, or you see your children get sick, or you see you have to go to hospital. So we see all the worst scenarios in our mind, and that's when our mind is being protective. You're not going to stop your mind from doing that. So trying to stop thinking about that, is actually more of a problem than anything else. So he says the goal is to find a balance in the things you're thinking about. If you feel the worst image taking shape in your mind, make yourself also think of the best image. So yes, we might all get a little sick, but the world will continue. Not everyone I love will die. To just kind of balance out those emotional flooding, that we experience, in anticipatory grief. Next slide, Andrea. Thank you. Okay, and then of course one of the most troubling experiences is how the COVID situation has changed mourning. The solitary aspect of grief has been magnified by the pandemic. The social ties that bind us and enable us to survive difficult times have been tested and changed over this time. So the mourning that we could have shared with people in the past has now become removed, and we're seeing it on screens, and it's a far off experience. So those are some of the issues that we're dealing with when we talk about the experience of grief during these times. Next slide, Andrea. Thank you. Okay, and then very clearly, grief changes your relationship to the world. Once you've been through that grief experience, your life will never be the same. You will never be the same. You'll always think about, who you are in the world differently. And when we go back again to the idea of stop all the clocks, in kind of, I want to say, normal or usual grief experiences, you have that sense of you standing perfectly still and the world around you is moving. So you leave the hospital after a loved one had just passed away, and you're amazed that the sun is shining and the robots are working and there's traffic in the streets and the children on the playing fields at the school is playing cricket and laughing, and all you want to do is to just bring the world to a standstill so that you can spend some time realizing what really is happening now. But I think that is different for COVID, and it's going to be interesting to think around how this has a different flavor in the COVID grief, because with COVID the world really did come to a standstill. We were locked in our homes. There was no traffic in the streets. The economy was shut down. There were no shops were open. So life did actually come to a standstill. And I think it's going to be interesting as time goes by to see how that experience is different in the grief process. Next slide, thanks, Andrea. Okay, that's something else that I'm interested in is anger, the importance of anger. Anybody who's been through the grief process will tell you that the one stage that cannot be skipped is anger. If somebody tells you I was never angry, you know that it's still coming. And when I think of specifically eco grief, when we think of the grief that we're experiencing because of the ecology and what is happening to nature and to the environment, the most poignant example of that anger is in the next slide, Andrea, thanks. of course, what we had seen with Greta Thunberg. The anger, the absolute seething anger she displayed in her speech at the UN Climate Summit just took everybody's breath away. And I think that is, such a visceral example of the anger that one experiences as part of the grief process. Next slide, Andrea, thanks. And then also something that worries me very much, and all you really need to note here is the very last line in this slide. I'm very worried about the way that we fall into war metaphors. When we talk about anger, it seems that we're channeling our anger about grief experiences into war metaphors. And here, for example, it says today, this is about Freedom Day during COVID. This symbolic time in our history is being celebrated while the country and the globe as a whole finds itself at war with the COVID-19 pandemic. It seems so easy for us human beings to just slip into that war metaphor. Next slide, Andrea, thanks. And the danger of the war metaphor when we deal with grief is that when anger, which is emotion, becomes rage, which is action, it is potentially toxic. And that is what happens when you inflict pain on others as a defense mechanism to avoid dealing with the overwhelming experience of your own pain that you're experiencing in your grief process. And that is exceptionally dangerous. Next slide. Thank you, Andrea. Okay, so Judith Butler, in her last and most recent work that she's been doing, has been speaking a lot about rage and grief. And she asks the question, if grief is a path to nonviolence. So if we can grieve better as human beings, if we can grieve better, will we then be less violent? And she says, we have to think about how rage carries sorrow and covers it. How often is sorrow effectively shouted down by rage? Sorrow can bring about the collapse of rage. The particular power of grief is to deflate rage of its destructiveness. And then she wonders, can we perhaps find one of the sources of nonviolence in the capacity to grieve, to stay with the unbearable loss without converting it into destruction? If we could bear our grief, would we be less inclined to strike back or strike out? Next slide, Andrea, thank you. Okay, so I've also been thinking about the idea of resilience, and resilience generally means carry on regardless. It originally comes from metallurgical engineering and then went into ecosystem recovery and then developmental psychology and then corporate management, and now everybody uses the term resilience. But resilience does not necessarily imply change or transformation. So the idea of springing back to what it was before is not always necessarily helpful. You can see how that is in metallurgical engineering, but it's something with like COVID or the eco crisis that we're going through. Just springing back and carry on regardless and get back to what we were before are not really options. Also, resilience is not the same for everyone. It could stigmatize or ostracize those who do not conform to the ideal of resilience expectations or timeframes. And I was wondering about whether the expectation to have resilience can induce shame, in that way. So for resilience to be more than just carry on regardless or spring back to the original, there has to be a new vision. A new vision is needed in order to provide a new response that is productive and constructive. And the term resilience in and of its own does not necessarily imply or provide a new vision. So we really need to think about that. Next slide, Andrea, thanks. Okay, then I've also been thinking about technology and how our addiction to technology mimics grief. And my question is, does our addiction to technology trick our minds into thinking that we lose something when we are not online or plugged in or connected? So in other words, are we thinking that we're experiencing some kind of death, when the cell phone is switched off? And then are we then incorrectly responding to this fake loss with symptoms of grief? And what implications does this have for when we are then confronted with real grief? if on a daily basis we have that experience of fake loss, in terms of our engagement with our technology, what happens when you really experience grief? Okay. Thanks, Andrea. That's just an idea. I haven't thought through that, very, very clearly. But I'd love your thoughts and your help in thinking through that. And then in meaning, many of you would know that if you go through the grief experience, there is very often not meaning to be found in what you're going through. Senseless violence, something like COVID, something like the eco crisis. It's impossible to find meaning in that. And Pauline Boss very, astutely says that in a case like that, senselessness is the meaning. That can be good enough if there is meaning to be found in other aspects of life. And the poet John Keats spoke of that as negative capability, which is the willingness to embrace uncertainty, live with mystery, and make peace with ambiguity. And I think for all of us, today, living in a world where there is so much violence, where there is so much, completely inexplicable things like COVID and the eco, challenges we live through, this sense of negative capability might be a space in which we could start to find some meaning, out of all of this. Next slide, Andrea. Thank you. Okay, so everybody who knows me knows that I don't let a chance go by without dragging a movie or a novel into my talk. But all of this made me think about the line in The Princess Bride, which is one of the most beautiful movies. If you haven't seen it, that's homework for you. In which Wesley says to the Princess Bride, the Princess Bride had lost her loved one. And she says to Wesley, who, accidentally is, the person, but she doesn't know it is him. But she says to him, "You mock my pain." And in response to that, he says to her, "Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something." And that, of course, is one of the best lines in movie history, but it also is the first noble truth in Buddhism. The idea that life is suffering. And that we cannot run away from it. So wherever you are, whoever you are, at some point in your life, you are going to be confronted with grief, with loss, and you're going to have to deal with that. It is inescapably part of life. Next slide, Andrea. Thanks. Okay, so for those of you who have children, this would be familiar. It's the movie Inside Out. If not, those of you who don't know it, I'd like to introduce you to this little blue-haired girl. Her name is Sadness. And the movie Inside Out plays out in the psyche, the mind of a young 11-year-old girl whose parents move from, I think, Wisconsin to San Francisco. And she has to go through all of these grief experiences. And in her mind, the main characters in the movie are the emotions. So there's Joy, the little one there in the middle. You can see who Joy is very clearly from her body language. She's kind of the self-appointed leader of the group, and she's a very good example of toxic positivity. And then there is disgust, the little green-haired one. Anger, you can immediately see the one with a fire jumping out of his head, and anxiety, or fear is the one who's just kind of screaming and running away. And then sadness is the fifth emotion. Next slide, Andrea. Thank you. If you haven't seen Inside Out, and if you have children, but even if you don't have children, this really is a film that everybody has to see. It's one of the most elegant ways of explaining, what the importance of sadness, of just not running away from grief and sadness. So in one scene in the movie, Sadness meets up with Bing Bong, the pink elephant type thing, is Bing Bong, and he is the imaginary playmate of the little girl, in whose head they all live. And she's growing up, so she's starting to forget her imaginary playmate, and he's sad about that. And he also loses something in the story that is, part of his identity. And then he sits down and he cries, and I couldn't find a picture of that, but when he cries, he cries sweets. So there's this, stream of candy wrappers, that comes out of his eyes when he cries. But in this moment of sadness, which is just the most beautiful example of what to do in, when you are the person, when somebody around you experiences grief, what to do. Sadness just goes and sits next to him, and she says to him, "I'm sorry they took something you loved. It's gone forever." She leans in, she makes eye contact, she listens to him talk. She puts her hand on his leg. There's just slight, human touch, and then she says to him, "Yeah, it's sad." So just sitting with sadness. So many people ask, how do I respond? How can I, help somebody who's in a process of grief? And sitting with sadness really is just the only way to do it. Listening to the person's sadness, being a witness to their grief. There's nothing that anybody can do to make the grief go away or to change it or to transform it. The only thing that one can do is to listen to what they say, to actually be there in the moment, to be a witness to the sadness. So please make a point of even if you've seen it before, make a point of watching Inside Out again. It really is in this time something very uplifting. Next slide, Andrea. Okay, Karen Armstrong, I'm very nearly finished. Karen Armstrong says, she calls this a listening attitude. And I think that really is the key to dealing with grief, is if we all can get to the point where we adopt that listening attitude and listen to ourselves, but also listen to others' stories. And then Ali Hochschild, who's considered the mother of the sociology of emotion, very interestingly also speaks about that. She did quite a lot of research recently in America, trying to see where the communication gap is between the blue states and the red states, and why there is this absolute split, this polar split. And she says that what one needs to do is to listen for the deep story, your own deep story and others' deep story, not just the superficial things, the real deep story, the core story of the sorrow. She says one has to take the facts out of the story, because sorrow does not have to do with facts. One has to focus on what feels true. Take the moral precepts out of the story. Just remove the kind of sacrosanct ideas we have about who's right and who's wrong. Find a metaphor in the story, because stories, grief, we function according to the way we imagine our lives, and that's always according to metaphors. She says, don't label, that creates estrangement. Put your alarm system off. So when you hear that little alarm in your head go off, it doesn't mean that you have to respond to it. And then listening does not mean agreeing, just understanding. So to understand another person's feelings does not mean that you agree with them, or that you feel that their feelings is necessarily the right ones. So I find Ali Hochschild extremely useful to think through all of these kind of experiences of grief. Next slide, Andrea, thanks. Okay, so and then I want to end by giving you an example of what I've come across, and is an example of social or cultural engagement with the necessity for us to ritualize and memorialize grief socially, especially amid COVID. Next slide, Andrea. Okay, so in Santa Fe, New Mexico, there is a yearly festival that's called the Burning of Zozobra. Zozobra means old man gloom. It's based on a local Mexican-American legend, and it basically, holds that old man gloom lives in the mountains of Santa Fe. All year long, he consumes and thrives on all the sadness and gloom of the local people. But once a year, he gets invited to an annual party in town, where he is set alight and he moans and he groans, and the gloom is dispelled. Next slide, Andrea, thanks. Okay, so in 2020, they went ahead with a festival. They obviously weren't people, but they telecast it. So what they usually do, and they did it this year again, was to build a 15-meter high hollow puppet, which is called Zozobra. In 2020, his hair was designed to look like the coronavirus. What people then do is they fill this hollow puppet with their glooms. People would write it on paper. They say some people, shred their divorce papers and they put that in there. So, so the whole thing is filled up with the sadness and the grief of people. And then on Labor Day, each year this is set alight amid this great festival. So it's the end of the old year. It's as that part of the world is going into their winter season. It symbolizes hope for a beginning of new once the winter and the grief is over. And next slide, Andrea, thanks. Okay, and then the gloomies also feature quite strongly in this legend. The gloomies are children. It represents the children of the town whose happiness and joy Zozobra had captured. They're a type of zombie that he then makes into his minions to use against their parents. And in 2020, it's not the clearest picture there, but the gloomies all wore corona masks. They had a couple of gloomies that danced around him. These were adults, not children, but they all wore the corona mask. Thanks, Andrea. Next one. And then the rest of the legend holds that torchbearers then enter the scene to scare off Zozobra, but they fail. And in 2020, the torchbearers wore medical scrubs in honor of the first responders. So they came in and then they tried to chase him away, but that doesn't happen. Next slide, Andrea, please. Okay, and then finally the fire spirit appears to battle Zozobra for the soul of Santa Fe. Now, they didn't make this clear, but one can possibly here think that finally the vaccination that is going to, become available would be the fire spirit that finally conquers Zozobra. So the fire spirit comes and she then, or he, this year is a woman, but, the fire spirit sets fire to Zozobra. Next slide, Andrea. And the ritual ends with Zozobra in embers, and all the glooms that he would contain within him goes up in flames with him. And then next slide. And then the whole thing ends with a celebratory fireworks and the traditional mariachi fiesta song. And this happens every year. This is not something that is just limited, to the COVID year. This is a festival that happens in this town every year, but they've adapted it, to the COVID scenario. And then they also ended this year with Maroon 5's song "Memories" in honor of the lives that were lost into the coronavirus. And if you watch this, this telecast, it really is incredibly moving. The moment when they play that. And then they also, follow that with the Beatles song, All You Need Is Love and Journeys Don't Stop Believing, in place of the big festival, obviously, with food and drink and music and people dancing. This was the way that they adapted it. And that is my last slide. Thank you for driving, Andrea.
Pleasure, Belinda. Right, I'm going to stop the share. If I can. Oh, good. Now I can actually see people. Okay, thank you. That was incredibly rich. A whole lot of things to think about. So what I would like to do is just invite people to either put reactions on the chat, although I must admit I'm going to have to look for it on my screen at the moment. Otherwise, if you would like to respond to Belinda in person, maybe just put your video on and I will wave at me and I'll have a look. But I must admit I'm finding it quite difficult to see where you all are. So I think chat would actually be more sensible. I found the chat function and I think, okay, so what I will do, Belinda, is just read the chat to you and maybe engage with you and invite people to engage. Sure. So Gary is saying great presentation and also apologies for having to leave. He's also having power issues. Sharon, not sure if there's time for questions. I think yes, we'll maybe go on a little more if you're willing to or happy to stay. And because yeah, I've got a whole paper full of questions to ask you, and I'm sure a whole lot of people have too. But Sharon would like to know: is one ever justified in limiting one's vicarious grief, or is that a lack of resilience?
Oh, good question, Sharon. I don't think, I think the point at which it becomes harmful to you is the point at which you need to, see danger signs. If vicarious grief becomes something that is harmful to you, if you find yourself in constant anxiety because of what you see on the news, if you find you can't sleep and you can't eat, if you find that that your experience of the quality of your life is diminished, not because of what your grief is, but because of the way that you're experiencing other types of grief. I think that is definitely a space in which one needs to pay attention, to the dangers of vicarious grief. And I don't know, resilience. I still have to. I have to spend a lot of time. One of my doctoral students at the moment is also working on resilience, so I'm spending a lot of time thinking about resilience. And I think it's a word that we need to use a lot less than we are using it at the moment. So I'd love to hear what you say about that, Sharon. I know it also fits in with a lot of the the work that you're doing in terms of your philosophical thinking. So thanks.
Okay, I see Christy saying very meaningful and thanking you, and Gary is back. I'm not seeing more kind of so while you're gathering your thoughts, I think we'll give it another 10 minutes or so. I think it would be very lovely to speak to you, but while you're gathering your thoughts and thinking about it, one thing I would like to ask you, but this will be a very difficult question to answer off the cuff, but I think it's something interesting and worth thinking about, and that is, if you reframe grief as a response to love. I love that. I think that's a very interesting and wonderful insight. Then would you change some of Kubler-Ross's stages or concepts? Because those are, as far as I understand it, basically in response to loss. So would then you have to kind of reframe that conceptual, those ideas? And I'm not asking you to answer that, because it's quite a hard question, but it might be a very interesting project.
It definitely would, and it's something that one needs to think about. My kind of immediate off the cuff idea is that it's not necessarily necessary to change them, but if you think about love as about grief as a response to love, the way those themes, I like to think of them as themes rather than stages, but the way those themes manifest in your living of your grief experience will possibly be different. So if you think of grief as a response to death, there would be a different kind of living, of that experience than if you think of it as love. The intensity will probably not be different. The length of time that it takes will not be different. It's just I don't want to even say the quality. I just think it's the perspective, the lens through which you will then experience those themes or stages, I think would be different. It would be like experiencing it through a different perspective. Than if it is, but I think that's a very interesting project to think about.
Yeah. There's that sense of better to have loved and lost than never to have loved, that kind of feeling.
Yeah. And I think anybody who's been through the grief experience will, in the early times, they would say to you, no, it is so overwhelming. I do not necessarily agree with that statement. But once you are later in the state, once you are at the point of acceptance and so on, then anybody who experiences grief would have had an attachment to something that they loved, whether it's a home or a person or a sense of self, your health, if you lose health or whatever. Everybody would say it was worth it in the end, or not worth it, but I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't exchange the love that I had for whatever it is that I had lost to not have had the grief experience.
Yeah.
That's also the part of the meaning making. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Belinda. Gary is back, and he says he liked the idea of not having to heal from grief, that it's a normal response. Grief is normal,
Yeah.
it's to be expected. Yeah, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think we pathologize so much these days, and it's become so easy. And I'm not saying that somebody going through grief would not need support, or help, or assistance, or a sounding board, or therapy. But the idea that I think it also holds a lot with the kind of our obsession with happiness. And joy, and it's like we're in a constant state of denial, about the fact that not every single moment of life can be happy. And what is happiness, and how do you achieve happiness? Or there's a lot of conversation at the moment going on around that. And I think when you internalize that idea that I've got to be happy the whole time, and if I'm not happy the whole time, there's something wrong with me, then it is very easy to get into a space where grief is pathologized. And if we do that culturally, when you think of all the social media and the buy, and the more you buy, the happier you'll be, those kind of discourses, I think feeds into that sense of there's something wrong with you if you're not happy, or there's something wrong with you if you're sad. And that can very easily spill into pathologizing. And we need to be very, very careful about that. Also, if you just think about something like how workplaces deal with grief. I mean, if your loved one, if your partner passes away, you literally get 4 or 5 days, to make all the arrangements, have the funeral, and then you've got to be back at the job. That's the extent of compassion leave. It's actually called compassionate leave. So many of our systems in society are just set up to not really acknowledge the fact that that this isn't something that you just switch on a switch and then you're over it. And yeah. So, thanks.
Belinda, we've got 3 more people that want to chat.
Sure.
Linda Jackson is just saying a comment that she
Hi,
found
Linda.
she found the picture frame where the ocean comes pouring out very meaningful. It's I suppose a response where just when you think the grief is contained, it breaks out and you're swamped all over again.
Absolutely.
That's the second wave that you're talking about. That, yes, okay.
Yeah.
And sorry, I'm just jumping a little bit on because we're really seriously running out of time. But and then Christy is wondering if it's possible to experience deep grief precipitated by the pandemic conditions as opposed to a single identifiable event. So is the pandemic grief different from, I suppose, individual grief?
I think it is. I think obviously if in the pandemic you had lost somebody, if you'd lost somebody, close to you as a result of the pandemic, that's a very personal grief. And then that's more kind of the, original, type of grief. But I think that what I call kind of free-flowing grief, it's the kind of grief that we, and that again, I think comes back to anticipatory grief. It's not necessarily it's not necessarily something that, or somebody that you personally had lost, but because of the way that something like our ecological crisis, or the COVID crisis puts our minds in a frame in which we know that we are vulnerable. More so than just in our normal, life. So that you are that you are vulnerable. You understand that at a very, very deep, psychological, deep cognitive level. You really do know that loss can happen at any moment. And the loss that one then experiences, I think, is a loss of certainty, a loss of security. So the grief, the grief, I think the grief that Christy maybe speaks of is that sense of grief about not having the security we had before the pandemic, not having the surety before. You might not yourself have lost your job, but you might know people who did, and then you know that you're living in a space where that is an option. So that's that anticipatory grief, knowing, constantly preparing yourself kind of psychologically the whole time that maybe tomorrow it could be me, or the next day or next year, or so at the moment, I was just a day or two ago, I was, with a group of people, where the conversation was, when the next COVID comes, not just the next wave, when the next virus comes. So we're already getting into that space where we're anticipating the next, and at one level that's necessary. But again, if that becomes an anxiety-ridden, experience, that is grief. If it feels like your sense of yourself, your sense in life, your place in the world, and who you are within the world is compromised, then it's probably a grief experience.
Thanks. Belinda, I think we should, Glenn has said that he would like to raise a question, and I'm imagining he'd
Sure.
like to do it vocally rather than in the chat. So maybe that should be our last question for the seminar. And if Glenn would like to kind of put his video on.
Thanks, Andrea. I am here. I'm not sure why you can't see us today, but nevertheless, Belinda, I really love this presentation that you did today, because as you know, I'm grappling with grief myself. But the one question that I have for you, and the thing which I was struck by in your presentation, is this concept that grief is an emotion and mourning is a behavior. And I'm taken by the title of your talk, "Stop All the Clocks," which is a thing about wanting to disable. And on one of your slides, you had a picture of the world with stop also, and wanting to stop things. And how do we reckon with this idea that when we are experiencing grief, we ourselves then feel disabled? We want to disable ourselves and the world around us, which I thought that metaphor of "stop all the clocks, stop the music on the piano" is such a beautiful metaphor. Can you tell us a bit more about why in sorrow we feel the need to disable? But thanks for a great talk.
Thank you, Glenn. Lovely to see you. Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I think we'll have to think about that a bit. But I also think it's because life moves so incredibly fast. I wondered when I kind of thought about this presentation, I wondered how, if we were talking to people from 100 years ago about grief, how different the experiences would have been. There would have been many, many more things that would have put them into grief, many more triggers for grief in that, in those times, when you think of the medical advances and, all of those things that we have. So I think they would have been much more frequently exposed to grief. But I think because of the pace at which we live at the moment in our world, this space and time, we don't take the time. We don't have the time. When you think of the mourning rituals, mourning rituals of a century ago, you wore black. If somebody died, you wore black for a year. That was the mourning. That's the enactment, the behavior. You and then after that you wore, I think, purple for a year. So it's this phased, culturally accepted, timeless, kind of experience, where now, as I said, with HR policies and things like that in companies, we give you 5 days and then you've got to be back at work. So I just think the sense of disablement, but also the need to disable, the need to unplug, has a lot to do with just the speed at which we live, and how overwhelming that makes the feelings. It's not just the cognitive dissonance and the emotional pain that you have to deal with. You have to deal with it fast, and you have to deal with it out of sight as well. You go back to work after something happened and everybody expects you to, yeah, she's sad, but you still need to be in the meetings, and everything flows the way it used to before. So we tend to want to deal with grief quickly and out of sight. It's been sanitized, and I think the sense of being disabled is because there aren't those support structures that recognize the loss, and also because we feel we need to distance ourselves from the world in order to make sense of what is going on. And I think it speaks also very eloquently to what you said in your presentation about silence. You know, and you know, the inner journey, the inner search, the hermit. Because I think most people going through a grief process will say they become in a way like a hermit. You know, there are times when you just have to, you know, lock the doors and spend time with yourself to catch up with what is going on. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but thank you. It's a very good question.
In any event, have to kind of start
Cool.
wrapping up now. Just one quick question from Tabang. He wants to ask you about intergenerational grief.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay.
I'm glad you know what it means.
Yes, intergenerational grief is incredibly interesting, and it goes a lot with the discussions around epigenetics. You know, at the moment, I'm definitely not an expert, but it basically holds that grief that is experienced by one generation is transmitted to the next generation, and that, you know, that's quite logical. You know, when you think of it just off the top of your head, your parents' experience would, you know, construct your life experience. You know, the previous generation, to a certain extent, you know, determines the conditions under which the new generation, you know, grows up. And then epigenetics specifically holds, and again, I'm not the expert here, but it's a very interesting area, you know, of research that says that within as much as one or two generations, the actual genetic and the biochemical makeup of human beings are changed, because not of their own experience of trauma, but because of the experience of trauma of a previous generation. So the idea of epigenetics is that it's evolution, but in the original Darwinian idea of evolution is it happens over, you know, centuries and millennia, where the idea of epigenetics is that emotional evolution can actually affect within one or two generations the actual, you know, genetic and biochemical makeup. There's a researcher called Rachel Yehuda who's at, I think, Harvard University. She works in biochemistry and psychology. And she's done incredible research with the children of mothers who were pregnant in their third trimester when the 9/11, when the towers came down on 9/11, and who were actually physically in the vicinity of you know, that happening. And they're looking at the levels of cortisol. And even though the children, who are now, I think they're close to 20 years old, that was what, 2001, so they should be nearly 20 years old now. They've been tracking the cortisol levels of those children, and the cortisol levels of those children are different because of the trauma the mothers experienced in the third trimester. She also does a lot of work with the second and third generation people in families where, you know, their parents or grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and with the children or grandchildren of veterans, you know, specifically Vietnam veterans, and how the generational experience carries down not only culturally and socially, but actually also manifests in the body, the biochemistry and the genetics. But that's as much as I can say about it. I'm, you know, not an expert on it, but it is an incredibly interesting area of research. Thanks, Tabang.
Yeah, thank you. That was an incredibly, I echo Linda there, a very meaningful, very fascinating and interesting hour, which could expand now into weeks and weeks, and I mean, as you have done, years of thinking about this. We are going to have to kind of finish. I know a couple of people have had to leave already and have sent apologies, but what I would like to try to do, my usual thing, is to have you put on your videos and just sort of say goodbye to Belinda, and yeah, then we will see you next week, hopefully, for our final wrap-up, sort of end of this series, way forward presentation, yeah, next Friday. Okay, so let me see if I can increase.
Thank you, Andrea.
You can see. Yes, thank you, Belinda. Oh, awesome, lovely.
Pleasure.
Now I can see everyone. Great. Hi, Christy. Hi, Sharon. Hi, Tabang. Hi, Glenn. Hi, Gary. Lovely to see you all. And yes, see you next week. Hi, Linda.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Hi. Ah, Tabang, lovely to see you. Hi, Zuki. So I can't see you yet. But okay, thank you so much. And see you next week.